I'll watch my P's and Q's now.
Oh, come on. Do you ever really watch your P's and Q's?
Not really.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Okay. We are there. John W. Morehead. This is the time we cause trouble. Or trouble causes us, one of the two. All right.
Synergistic, yeah.
A little discussion had already begun before. Yeah, it was. I did a little. So we're defending, befriending. Well, what would Jesus do? What would Paul do? What should we do?
Right.
And so one of the responses was, "What does that matter?" It's just, what should we do? Then I challenged it back with if we live in a solipsistic worldview, that's okay. But once the other comes into our life, their position matters. So and then it was kind of going back and forth. It was a really good little discussion with my buddy. Yeah, that was with Bill Legault from Salem. Yeah, great guy. So we were having a good time. So, we're on, and some people are already watching us. So, hey, welcome to the Wild Theology Podcast. This is me, Phil Wyman, and that is John W. Morehead. And we're co-conspirators in the crimes of trying to do good works that aren't always perceived as being good works, are they?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So tell a little bit about your story of how you got to the place of befriending people who might not deserve it. And, at least in the eyes of others, that's the case, right?
Yeah. Some would say I don't deserve it. Sometimes that's so, but let's see. Well, basically in a nutshell, growing up, I was agnostic, but we also had roots in a Mormon offshoot, reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Right.
And I eventually got baptized, was a member of that church for a few years, had that burning in the bosom experience, that subjective feeling that the church was true. And I eventually encountered Christian apologetic material. I read Walter Martin's Kingdom of the Cults, and he had a chapter on Mormonism. But although it didn't directly relate to my particular branch that I was involved in, there was enough there to raise doubt. And so I reluctantly became an evangelical, but I was a very troubled, skeptical one. If I had what I thought was a religious experience in this other tradition, how do I know Christianity's true? So I eventually became very attracted to an apologetic approach. And I was involved in, because I thought, I think Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict kind of summarizes an evangelical attitude.
Right.
Right. So
which briefly describe that. Josh McDowell's approach.
Yeah. Some colleagues and I, Philip Johnson in Australia came up with the term for the particular approach, heresy rationalist apologetic. And that is, we tend to look at other religious groups, particularly the so-called cults or new religions, as systems of heresy. And the way we analyze them and relate to them is through comparative charts, right? Here's what we believe. It's from the Bible. Here's what you guys believe. It's false. Here's why. And now we've refuted it. And the curious thing is, not only does that function for many as kind of a boundary to protect us from them, doing apologetic defense and confirmation for us, sometimes we think it's an evangelistic model too. It's like, if I tear down what you believe and say the Bible doesn't say that should warm your heart my message, right? And
Right.
I just came to see challenges with that. I started reading in history of Christian mission and looking at how missionaries in overseas, non-Western contexts would come to love the people, embed themselves in the culture, learn about what they believe, and not only proclaim to them and defend, but actually get involved in their life ways. And I thought that was interesting, and I wondered why the contrast, and I eventually just couldn't do the apologetics thing anymore. I didn't think it was biblical, looking at things like Paul in Acts 17. And so I eventually got out of there and got into a cross-cultural missions approach, and eventually that would lead to questions I started asking myself. I was doing culturally sensitive evangelism, and I still believe in sharing my faith. I think everybody shares what they believe in and find most passionate.
Right.
But I asked myself, what do I do when the people I'm sharing with simply choose not to embrace my religious pathway? How do I live as a faithful disciple of Christ in the midst of religious plurality and do that thing? And that's how I kind of came to this multi-faith engagement or religious diplomacy thing.
So you don't shake the dust off your shoes and move on?
I don't. No, that doesn't mean that there are times when I encounter people who just want nothing to do with what I have, my approach, and people in other religious traditions. And sometimes you may have to take a harder stance. They're rejecting you, you're rejecting, we're just at loggerheads. But for the most part, I think we can come to understand others and as Walter Martin used to say, agree to disagree agreeably. And,
right. So I remember having some of those charts that were like, here's on this side what the Bible says, on this side what Mormons believe. Here's what the Bible says, here's what Jehovah's Witnesses believe. I remember having the charts you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Now, what about you? I don't know if I've ever heard your story about how, I encountered you, we encountered each other. I think I was more in transition when we first met.
And was I already in Salem?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I think we had bumped into each other a couple times before that.
I thought we had met at an EMNR conference, Evangelical Ministries to New Religions, and I was on leadership then, but I was having serious doubts with the methodology.
We had met before that, and actually you asked, that was the one at Biola?
It might be, yeah.
And then, because you had contacted me and said, would you come? I could use your...
Right. Yeah, because I think that was...
And it caused a bit of a stir because I was doing the thing about befriending witches, which, it was in a kind of a regular sized classroom, but people were hanging out the doors and there was no room inside to fill any more.
Just saying something for that conference because they didn't usually have very many attendees. So for whatever reason, we packed them in.
That was a lot of fun. So I, after becoming a Christian, which was kind of a radical experience, that was me getting slapped across the face by an invisible hand on 2 separate occasions. That's when I was 21. It was very quickly that I ran into some people who were doing work with the ex-Mormons for Jesus, and back when Saints Alive were still around. So this is 1980. So I actually did a little bit of traveling around to churches talking about Mormons and what they believed, and ended up in Manti very quickly. And, so I was good friends with Bill McKeever, and, he was still down in San Diego at the time. Right. And I was living in Escondido. And so, what was her name? Remember Granny Greer?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, she's in the film The Godmakers, I think, or the
Godmakers. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, actually, she was just a lovely person. I mean, she was so cool. I remember driving her to some event one time, and we stopped to get gas, and there were some bikers there, and she's dressed in her outfit to look like, the Mormon, the Old West Mormon woman traveling across the country. She would tell her whole story and have the outfit on and the pioneer look. And she gets out of the car and there's some really rough biker there. And she just walks up to him and they start talking. And this guy melted in front of her.
Wow. Nice.
She said, "You would make a beautiful Christian." And he was like, "Oh." Yeah, it was fantastic. So I was involved with that, and I just kind of naturally lent myself toward trying to befriend people, even if I was debating them.
Right.
So if I was in the craziest situations, it didn't matter. So I got to know people in Manti, but I'm still hanging out with all the street preachers and the circus that it was.
So you really didn't shift from an adversarial kind of mindset.
No.
Whereas I did.
Yeah. So see, I would enjoy debating those points, but for me, it was never adversarial. Okay. It was talking about life and what do we believe, and and so it wasn't a significant shift for me because for me, I love debating, and I'm still passionate about debating.
Yeah.
So. Although there was a lot to learn because the people who loved debating oftentimes had that adversarial position, right?
Right.
And so I was encircled by it, right? And I kind of had to swim my way through it to find my own place. Now, a lot of that came to the forefront. Finding my own place had a lot to do with studying neo-paganism in preparation for moving to Salem, because I figured I'm not just going to a town where there's witches, a few witches. I'm going to live and breathe and hang out with neighbors who are witches. So I gotta find out not just what they believe, but what they believe about me. Why they identify with me or don't identify with me, what they like, don't like, that kind of stuff. And so then I was developing deep relationships with these people. And that transitioned me to maybe a deeper look at what this friendship thing means, right? Then, of course, you do that aggressively enough or openly enough and you're going to take it on the chin because people, right? Yeah. So you've had some experience with that, right?
You mean pardon
taking it on the chin? Yeah.
Let me close
the dog has to be a part of the event.
Yes, hold on one sec. There we go. Door closed. Live to Facebook.
Yeah.
You mean from within the evangelical tribe? Is that?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. Of course, there's going to be some of it from outside, but from my experience, I get more flack from my own tribe than I do from.
Yeah, I mean the term that folks tend to use is interfaith. I don't use that term because there's some commonalities with interfaith, but I also have some disagreements. But for the purposes of the conversation, there's interfaith and there's intrafaith. And for me, the challenge has always been within evangelicalism. I've gotten some flack. I had a pagan gentleman online who took issue with me and said I was unethical because I was advocating an approach that was not only diplomatic and dialogical, but also included at times an interest in mutual persuasion, if possible. You shouldn't be evangelizing. That's just not on the table. And so the disagreement got so strong that I was unethical and this kind of thing.
Right.
But by and large, the reaction from people in other religious traditions, even when we, everybody recognizes we seriously disagree, there's no attempt on compromise for anybody. They appreciate the attempt. But it's been from within the evangelical tribe. And I think a lot of the flack came because I was a part of the counter cult community in evangelicalism. That is a segment of, for folks who don't know, there's a segment of evangelicalism that devotes itself specifically to doing apologetic refutation of people in other religious movements. And they call themselves counter cult. And I was a part of that. I was a member of Watchman Fellowship in California. I was serving on the board. In fact, for a couple of years, I was president of Evangelical Ministries to New Religions, an umbrella organization. And I started to introduce missional ideas. Maybe we don't have to be adversarial. Maybe we can be more like a cross-cultural missionary in an overseas context. And that just did not go over well at all. It went from disagreement over ideas and methodology to ad hominem. I mean, I had folks come to my blog, where I was blogging at Morehead's Musings at the time. Right. And I had folks who accused me of not only being unethical, maybe I wasn't a Christian. I remember once going on a weekend, I'm in Utah, and I had Ogden Pagan group that invited me to come up and do a little presentation. I developed relationships with them, and we had a little Saturday activity, and I got back and blogged about it, and a Christian posted afterwards something very short, a comment, but it hit right to the matter. It said, "Birds of a feather, ... Right? So I've been accused of being a closet pagan, of being Mormon. You know, how could you possibly be a real Christian and yet have positive, friendly relationships with people in these groups? And there's not only theological reasons why there's these reactions, there's psychological ones. But yeah, there's been a lot of flack. In fact, just to put an exclamation point on it, years ago, I lost one of my sons, and I had a well-meaning apologist who came to my blog and said God was judging me because of my rejection of an apologetic approach, and this was God's judgment. So it can get pretty nasty. Yeah.
Yeah. And I've had similar things like that occur.
Yeah.
So what you had said about there are a lot of reasons biblically for pursuing friendships goes right to a question that popped up on Facebook here. So a friend of mine, Larry Higgins, asks, are there any Bible verses about befriending people in cults?
Befriending people in cults. Well, of course, the word cult doesn't show up in the Bible.
Right.
You know, but are there Bible verses that talk about befriending people who are in other religious traditions? I just think we have to be careful about the questions we ask of the Bible. I don't know that it should be looked at as a rule book, but it does provide examples and stories and illustrations of how people are relating to each other. And I think one of the greatest ones is Jesus, for example, with the woman at the well in the Gospel of John, right? He has this conversation with a Samaritan woman. There was enmity between the Samaritans and the Jews. They had all kinds of religious and cultural disagreements. And yet Jesus has this conversation over religious things. There wasn't enough time for a friendship, but they certainly were friendly in their interaction.
Right.
And the disciples come upon him because they had left to get water. And they come back and they're marveling. Why in the world is Jesus talking to this woman, right? One, she's female. Secondly, she's Samaritan. And third, she's alone in that culture. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to have a male accompanying you.
Right.
So, yeah, there are all kinds of problems with that. So I think Jesus is a primary example. Jesus he primarily in the Gospels has interactions with Jews, but there are a few instances, and the fact that they're few makes them even more significant, with Gentiles, with outsiders, a Roman centurion, a Syrophoenician woman, and these kinds of things. So Jesus reaches across and outside of his religious culture, and he does it in a positive way. And Jesus is known. What was they attempted it as a slur, the religious leaders. Jesus had a reputation for hanging around with outsiders, right? You know,
he was a drunkard and a sinner, right?
And he was too, so he got the personal slur. So I think there are plenty of, even though the Bible doesn't say thou shalt befriend cult members, I think there are plenty of examples in Jesus, in Paul, for taking a very friendly kind of approach. And I see no reason to restrict friendships to people who are Christians.
Yeah. I suppose it becomes somewhat of a difficult question because we don't really find a theology of friendship, right?
Right.
Within the scriptures.
Yeah.
It's not telling us how to like people.
Right.
Or at least I would say we don't see that it's telling us how to like people.
Right.
I have a great have a big problem with the I can love somebody and not like them approach.
Right, right.
You know, I suppose I see a place for that at times, but if I don't like somebody,
does that work with a spouse?
I probably doesn't. Yeah, exactly.
You know?
Yeah. If I don't like somebody, I probably don't love them.
Right, exactly.
Am I going to give them the same approach that I would somebody that I like being around? You know, if my approach toward God and his relationship with me was based upon that kind of thinking, then God probably, you know, would be the person to go, I really love you, but, you know, when you get to heaven, I got a place way out in another galaxy where I don't have to see you.
Right.
Right. And
yeah.
And that I think God's love for us also involves he wants to hang out with us and he enjoys being with us. All right. So my love for another somehow has to represent that kind of thing. And if fellowship with God is an intimate and a close thing with dialogue, then my relationship with other people and trying to express God seems like it ought to have that same kind of thing, no matter how far away I may perceive them to be.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, it's my perception.
Yeah. And there's the whole love thy neighbor thing and love your enemy. And if that doesn't somehow involve friendship, it seems like a strange concept of divine love to me. But yeah, I think you're onto something there.
Yeah. I you know, so I remember sitting in. There's no other way to describe it. It was an inquisition. There were 13 leaders of the denomination. Isn't that classic? There were 13 in a circle, and 4 of us from the gathering in Salem, and we were being questioned about our orthodoxy because of the way we had approached the pagan community. And somebody asked the question, how can you be friends with witches? There was a 45-minute discussion. When the question was asked, you know, we looked at each other like, they're like our neighbors, duh. You know, how do you handle a question like that? Because to us, it was such a great absurdity. And after like 45 minutes of discussion, then one of the ladies pops up with the statement that, oh, you know, I do have a friend at work who's a witch, and she's really a lovely person, and we're friends. And I'm thinking, and it takes 45 minutes for you to come up with an example of how this is a possibility.
Yeah.
You know, so for us, it was a way of life, but for them, it was because we intentionally did it.
Right.
It was perceived as somehow outside the scope of Orthodox doctrine, right?
Yeah, which brings up, and I think you and I should acknowledge for folks, you know, I understand and appreciate the fear and the concern about this kind of approach, in that people don't want to be spiritually compromised. Right. They don't want to be contaminated. And the concern is if I it's one thing to defend the gospel, do apologetics, or proclaim, because that can just be, it's just a one-way thing. But you guys are talking about friendships, mutual conversation, humility, listening, as well as proclamation. And that is far more risky. Is there a risk of contamination? Yeah, there is. However, studies indicate that in these interfaith or multi-faith kinds of conversations, more often than not, what happens is the faith of the conversation partners ends up being strengthened by way of contrast through the conversation, rather than one converting to the other. Does conversion sometimes happen? Yeah, it does. But, you know, Terry Muck is one of my heroes. He used to be, years and years ago, he was editor of Christianity Today. He worked at Asbury Seminary as a professor of mission. He's been involved in evangelical Buddhist dialogue for years. And in some of his writings, he draws upon the parable of the talents In that story, one servant goes and hides the talent, doesn't want to take any risks, and the other one goes and risks and invests it. And when the investor comes back, he rewards the one who took risk, not the one who played it safe. And he applies that to multi-faith conversations. Is it risky for what you and I do? Certainly it is, but I think it's worth the risks in terms of investing in other people and in terms of what we're trying to do in making this a better world to live in.
Yeah. So I have seen those risks. I've seen both sides of that. One of the places I've perhaps seen it strongest is in relationship to festival outreach, right? So taking teams of people to places like Burning Man, and you having been there, written a paper about it, did was a master's
Right.
thesis, right?
Yeah.
On Burning Man. There's a lot of temptation at Burning Man, isn't there? I mean, it's a wild and a crazy place, and you can find anything you want, but that's the whole spectrum from, deeply spiritual to intensely hedonistic. And, so all of that is at the event. And so I've seen people who have fallen because of that, that people who were supposedly strong Christians, and their investment into Burning Man becomes an eventual investment into kind of hedonistic practices. Sure. And families being ruined and things like that. I've seen that happen, and that actually brings a strange phenomena into the picture, because it seems that some of the people who were supposedly the most mature and strongest in the faith, and actually had some real hardline views, were more likely to fall than some people who they were just barely Christians. They were like, oh, I like this Jesus guy, but somehow they fit into it, and they found a place of mission and a depth within their own spirituality by being involved with something like that, and didn't fall into the temptations. There's some strange thing going on, that it wasn't our perception of maturity that determined whether a person was able to handle the dynamics of whether it's interfaith relationship. So, I've certainly seen Christians who, all of a sudden they want to get involved in tarot and astrology and things that, typically everybody's going to be really scared about, or, they start adopting the theology of the other and maybe eventually turn to that. I've seen that where conversion, kind of occurs both ways. Yes, there's a danger, I suppose, but I tend to think that we take what is in us with us to that relationship. There's always that danger everywhere.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And we're just acknowledging that concern, but I think what we're trying to say is, let's not let that concern. And if you really search your heart and don't think that this kind of thing can work for you for whatever reason, that's fine. But it's another thing not to do it, another thing to disparage it.
Right.
But I think we would encourage folks, this is worth the risk. It's good for us, and it's good for the other, and it's good for our neighborhoods and the world we're living in. Right.
Yeah. So Mike Steigel is on right now.
Hey, Mike.
and he makes a statement that it causes you to reflect why you believe what you believe, which very often strengthens your beliefs because your analysis process provides you with more robust foundations. So he's in a sense echoing what you just said.
Yeah.
These relationships where we disagree with the other, we actually strengthen our own position.
Yeah.
I've always had a problem with being part of an amen crowd. That was really boring. Right? I didn't want everybody to agree with me in the room. I wanted something a little more exciting to be happening. in the processes of life.
I mean, just in my own conversations. I mean, yesterday I did a podcast that hasn't been published yet with Lauren Wilkinson, who's retired from Regent. He's done a lot of work as a Christian in earth stewardship and creation care. And Bron Taylor, who was an advocate of dark green religion. It's kind of an eco-spirituality. And listening to Bron's story as a former evangelical about how he just could no longer accept the Christian message, and how his love for the environment kind of came together to where he is today, makes me reflect on my understanding of my religious tradition and its relationship to the environment. My conversations with Latter-day Saints, they believe in a God who's embodied, who's material.
Right.
And that has made me go back and research and think about and reflect on the philosophy of how we understand the nature of God. So these kinds of conversations and ideas don't happen if we're just kind of nestled comfortably within our own religious tradition. So it gives us an opportunity to go deeper.
Yeah. So describe some of the relationships around you that you have, and you've described a couple points here of how some thoughts with individuals, it's deepened your own thinking, and not necessarily by fully changing it, right by deepening it. So describe what those relationships look like. What do you do with the other?
Well, let me tell you about one that kind of just fell into my lap out of curiosity most recently. I had been reading about the Satanic Temple based in your former backyard in Salem.
Yeah.
They capture a lot of headlines because they do some very provocative things to capture attention and to try.
Oh, they're out on the streets with a, talk to a Satanist booth and, flyers every Halloween time.
Yeah.
They're fairly new to town. They came out of Cambridge, and somebody bought a house in Salem and they set up there.
Yeah. And they've captured national attention in the headlines.
Yeah.
They put together a Baphomet, a huge, I think it's iron or bronze Baphomet statue, and challenged in a couple of states 10 Commandments monuments on state property. And so they're very good at capturing attention and causing us to question Christian privilege in the public square. And I was intrigued by it, and I just put out on Facebook, hey, I'm interested in talking to somebody who's a member of this group, and if anybody knows anybody, if you could help make a connection. And I got a pagan friend of ours, David Dashvin Keys, who said, yeah, I know somebody.
Yeah.
And I also know another a scholar, Joseph Laycock, who's written a book on it. And those two guys kind of helped me connect with somebody, Stephen Bradford Long. He's got a podcast called Sacred Tension. And we exchanged some emails, and I came on his program. And the first program was largely me asking him questions on his show,
right,
to help evangelical listeners who might dare to tune in to understand more about Satanism and his journey and the Satanic Temple and this kind of thing. And it was interesting during the course of the conversation. It was I don't know, there was some kind of, not only because it's called Sacred Tension, but we didn't know each other and you could feel the tension.
Right.
I think because of the way we were conversing, towards the end of the conversation, he said, can I ask you some questions? I said, yeah, that'd be great. And so he asked me my thought on how evangelicals should respond to former evangelicals, ex-evangelicals. And he was one. And I said, well, there's a tendency to demonize those. We blame them for not having enough faith and this kind of thing. I think we need to listen critically to those journeys. What does it say back to the church about our failures in so many areas? And I think that was well received. And eventually he had me back on the podcast to talk about the research you and I and our Multi-Faith Matters team had done into the psychology of evangelicals and why we reject other religious traditions. And then most recently, he and I co-authored an article for Paul Louis Metzger of Multnomah University, his Cultural Encounters Journal, where basically I look at Jesus as an outsider figure that inspires me in multi-faith, and he looks at Satan not as a literal, real spiritual being, but as a metaphor and literary figure of rebellion that inspires him as a Satanist in multi-faith engagement. And so this relationship came together just out of the blue, and through conversations and empathy for one another, we've been able to do some work together. So,
oh wow!
And just as a PS to that, there was a Satanist. Stephen asked me to write a blog post for his blog also, and I wrote on evangelical fear of Halloween, which is right up your alley, Phil. And another Satanist saw that and read it, and then he did a blog post for Stephen saying, Morehead is right, and rather than just demonizing evangelicals, we need to understand the fear and how we sometimes trigger that, and how can we have a more positive relationship. You don't get to that point of a positive interaction with Satanists, who many times are having a reaction against Christianity, unless you pursue this kind of friendship approach.
Right. So there was an example of your developing of a relationship, creating some of the Satanist community to rethink how they approach evangelicals.
That's the end result. I didn't set out to say, you know what, I'm going to help these guys like us better. It was just me being willing to have a conversation with somebody and help evangelicals understand where they're coming from. And then through my responses to some of their inquiries and doing some writing and being, I am, and I think you are too, we're very self-critical at times, not only of ourselves, but of our faith tradition.
Absolutely.
And we get heat for that sometimes. You know, you guys sound, and I just try and remind our critics, you know, that seems pretty prophetic to me. The prophets were always, prophets weren't always pointing finger at the nations. They were most of the time pointing it at Israel and her failure, keeping the covenant with God. Yeah. And so there's something prophetic, and I don't think I'm a prophet, but there's something in the prophetic tradition to what we're doing. Right. And that isn't always well received, but sometimes the outsider can see that and find appreciation, particularly if they've had negative experiences with the church.
Yeah. And that becomes that becomes one of the touch points from which we experience a lot of the kickback from our own tribe. Sometimes just the action of befriending the exiled other, the post-Christian who's now adopted another religion. Sometimes that in itself becomes a critique on Christianity. You behave in that way. You don't have to say much to have just said, look, we're doing it wrong. Here's how we ought to do it. You don't even have to say that. You just do things that way. And it's going to be automatically perceived as a critique before we say something. Then when we open our mouths, we're really in trouble. and a lot of that is because I have found that I spend a lot of time agreeing with the critiques of Christianity by my friends who are outside of my faith. Christians, I look at the history of the church and it's greedy and power hungry and, all these terrible things are going on, and I shake my head. I say, yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah. And I can typically say, but I don't see Jesus doing it that way, and I'm just trying to do things his way in a simpler Christianity. And most people will agree with that as a valid observation, right? But then, that obviously presents a problem to my own tribe, because I've just said, yeah, we've gotten it wrong. And in fact, we've gotten it wrong for centuries. So, how do we deal with that dynamic of having to, is that right for me to openly admit the faults of my own group, in a sense? Like, are we putting out our dirty laundry when we do that?
I don't know that our dirty laundry is really hidden. I mean, right? I mean, it's out there. I mean, maybe in the past you're able to do it, but especially with the internet now and social media, and especially in a post-Trump kind of world. I mean, it's out there. And so I think the healthy way to address it is just to acknowledge that it's there. I think if you keep on denying it, trying to justify it, that just makes our present situation worse. I mean, I think evangelicalism now is suffering a serious credibility problem. And you can come up with all the evangelistic programs, you can come up with a great worship service and this kind of thing, but unless you address the rot at the heart of evangelicalism, we're not going to see any turnaround. So my hope is for no other reason than rehabilitation of our brand, that evangelicals might be willing to be self-critical.
Yeah. So we just got a hey guys from Jill Riley.
Hey Jill.
Yeah. That made me happy to see her pop up here. That there's somebody who knows how to do the stuff
that's right.
Talking about. Yeah. Yeah. Hope you're doing well, Jill. So where do we, I suppose I want to ask this question, where do we go from here? I found, I'll put that question in perspective. So I found over the years that, people would come to Salem during Halloween and work with us. At first, it would be a few people, and there'd be a lot of skepticism, and then they'd experience and they'd be like, wow, I got to come back. And, so over 20 something years, it went from a handful of us doing outreach on the streets and having a stage where there was live music. And because it was a community stage that we sponsored, it wasn't like Christian concerts. It was just entertainment. And we had these encounter tents where people would enter them if they wanted to, discuss things with us. And they were creative. We had dream interpreters, who did it from like a Hebraic biblical perspective. And we had people who were doing psalm readings instead of palm readings. And people loved it. And they were standing in line. We'd just have prayer for the sick or whatever. Over the years, I found that it slowly moved from a position of people who were fearful to a position where now I can make statements about how necessary it is for us to befriend witches and not treat them badly. And a crowd of people I'm training will applaud. I mean, it's moved from being very aggressively, get that counter cult approach, and let's cast out demons and, whatever else, depending on somebody's religious, whether they're Pentecostal or Baptist or, whatever it was, to now understanding that us being friends and loving people on the streets and trying to develop relationships with them is at the heart of the matter. But it's still not, I wouldn't say it's still not the standard that we see across evangelicalism, even though it's accepted more. So where do we go from here?
You mean in terms of trying to help?
Yeah, trying to help the church see these necessity of behaving like this, especially in our growing multi-faith culture, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the numbers are dropping. If you look at the rise of the nuns, those who say they're not affiliated with any, institutional religion, that number is growing. Number of across the board for Christian traditions, those numbers are going down. Yeah. So that's the reality we face. And again, the backdrop of that is post-Trump, our credibility is in the tank. And I really think, if you look at the history of the church, I think the church does best when she's on the margins, not when she's at the center, right? And she's got power and this kind of a thing.
Right.
I think there's a hidden blessing in our present marginalization, but we've got to recognize the marginalization. That's the challenge. So I think if we can recognize that we are on the sidelines, our numbers may still be good in terms of the number of people who claim identification with Christianity in the general population, but the numbers are going down, our credibility is gone. And so maybe it's time to look in the mirror and say, man, what is going on? Yeah. And if we're willing to do that, hopefully with that can come, what is my stance towards the other? and is either ignoring them and just doing my own thing, happy in the walls of the church and the Christian community. Is that the best way forward? Or doing apologetics and refuting those that we disagree with? Is that the best way forward? Or is it Or is it asking that question that I asked myself years ago? How do I live as a faithful disciple of Jesus Christ in the midst of a rapidly changing world where a lot of people are going to choose to reject the spirituality that I hold dear? Am I defensive about it, or can I befriend others? And through our strongly held differences, can we still have relationship and friendship for the common good of the society we live in?
Sure. Yeah, we just did there was just some statistics from Gallup, I think it was, this week, that the people going to church in any form whatsoever has dropped below 50% for the first time. It's been a precipitous drop through the 20th century, but it just hit below the 50% mark. I was surprised that it was even there. Quite frankly, if I look around me, right? Although it's an interesting thing, being back in Southern California has made me see that a little bit different. So here in Long Beach, a couple places I might hang out. I hang out at a place called Fat Stogie's, a cigar lounge in Long Beach. And it's amazing how many people are Christian and have a church that they go to in that environment. In Salem, Massachusetts, that you were in a minority, maybe an extreme minority. It certainly felt like it, and it's and so it's not the case here. But our numbers are dropping, and those numbers include those of us who have been disillusioned by our own Christian faith, and now have a hard time identifying with its corporate expressions. That whether denomination or any kind of local church, right?
Right.
And
the nuns.
Yeah. So I personally find that in some of the things I'm doing in festivals, people who have kind of gotten done with, they're tired and they're done with church.
Right.
Absolutely love joining us in situations and festivals where we're doing an outreach, and they shine. But they were misunderstood in the church, right?
Yeah. I know that feeling. I'm sure you do too.
Oh boy. Yeah. I've got the certified letter.
Yeah. Well, another thing I think is going to help us move forward. I think that, I've been asking myself for years, what is missing from evangelicalism? And Paul Metzger and I've had some conversations, our mutual friend at Multnomah, and we try to practice a cruciform spirituality. And I Googled that term, and I found some works by Michael Gorman. He's got this trilogy of books where he, starts with Paul, and that's the essence of Paul's theology, cruciformity, to be in Christ. And it doesn't mean operating from a position of power, proclaiming to others without listening, renouncing the other. It means humility. It means, taking on the mantle of Christ, just as he came in his ministry to give his life for others, to serve others. That's what he's calling us to do. And I don't think that dominant form of relating to religious others in our culture is cruciform. I think this befriending those who evangelicals would consider outsiders, that's more cruciform. So I really think we have to dig deep in our own spiritual practice. What does that look like in this new environment? Do we need to pursue a different way?
That's a great Good Friday recognition there of this day represents how we ought to live, right?
Yeah.
We live in a death to self, and that has become, at least from my observation, it seems to become a thing that has been missing in much of an evangelical tradition that's seeking political power. It's seeking to maintain its position of dominance as the American religion and as a way of life, and the culture that we live in. and trying to maintain that dominance seems to be the opposite of living within a crucifixion model, right?
Right.
And it makes me wonder: is Jesus' silence at the trial, before the Pharisees and the crowd, and then before Herod, is his silence something of a model for me in the face of opposition? Both internally from those who attack me, as the Pharisees would have been an internal opposition from a religious and tribal perspective, but then externally from those outsiders, the pagan Romans. Is that silence of Jesus somehow give me a model for not having to defend myself at all costs?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it can be, certainly at certain times. Sometimes with some of my attempted defenses with some of my counter-cult folks, it doesn't seem to matter what I say, what I point to, what I do, that can even register, let alone persuade. I mean, you had an idea when you and I were going back and forth about doing this podcast. You had the great suggestion. Why don't we invite some of the critics to come on and they can give their perception for a few minutes and we'll respond to it. And
right.
I reluctantly, you didn't know this, but I said, all right, Phil, we'll give it a shot. I'll reach out to a few folks. And I reached out to a couple of the counter-cult folks
I
interacted with in the past. Now, keep in mind, I was in the counter-cult about 20 years ago.
Right.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
And I reached out and said, hey, we're doing this podcast. And, here's the deal. Would you like to come on and be a part? And I tore the scab off of their old wounds. And it was like we were back 20 years ago.
Wow. Okay.
And so they're still angry with me over this kind of thing. And they said, you still haven't described why what you're doing is different than what we're doing and all this kind of stuff. And I did respond and a few times, and I gave links. I said, wrote a paper for the Lausanne Committee for World Evangelization. We've got a book with case studies and theory. I've done articles. I don't know how to describe it anymore. And I drew upon that phrase. I can explain it to you, but I can't understand it for you. And sometimes the question arises for me, do people not understand, or do they not want to understand? And I think we get to the point where maybe with some, silence just is the best way forward. You're modeling it for people. And if they don't get it, then they're probably not going to get it no matter what I say.
Yeah. And I certainly think, of course, Jesus' situation is one where he's being attacked, right?
Right.
He's being accused, and so his silence becomes somewhat of a model. But then, in a sense, that's what I do when somebody comes to me. I don't know if you can hear the sirens in the background here.
No, we're good.
Okay, that's good. I hear them. So when somebody attacks my faith, telling me that all the problems that there is with it, and they're legitimate descriptors of things that have happened either in history or maybe even current events, or sometimes maybe something I did it could be legitimate. I have to shake my head and just agree, rather than coming with a position of defending myself. The humility is, yep, you're right. And too often, I think Christianity wants to defend itself. But it defends itself at the expense of those it had previously betrayed. But, so if we defend ourselves against things, for things we've done wrong, I speak corporately there as well as personally, then we double down on the betrayal we've caused others, right? So if somebody is hurt and I defend the action, I double hurt them. Yeah. And I think that's what we've had a tendency to do within Christianity, is to double down on the pain we've caused others. So the place of dying to that stuff is it's a good time for it. It's a good Friday to do it.
Yeah, definitely. And the challenge for you and I is, I don't know about in your experience, but sometimes even when I came out of the countercult, I just came to the mindset, you guys do your apologetic thing. I'm not going to try and persuade you anymore. Doesn't work for you. You didn't want to do it. That's fine. I'm going to do my missional dialogical thing over here.
Right.
And that wasn't enough. I was pursued. And, and I will admit early on, I did have an angry response. These guys would nip it at my heels. I would do posts. I was going through seminary at the time, and I was reflecting on my studies and the new things I was learning and what I was reflecting on. And they would pop in and do all these negative comments. And so it took me a while to work through that response process. And for years, I've ignored them and just kind of let them do their own thing. And they can think what they want of me. It was only recently with the attempt at reaching out after 20 years that we discovered. So, yeah.
It's I suppose I was fortunate in the sense that when I moved to Salem, yes, there were critiques, but I had, in a sense, embedded myself into that community, right? So now I was surrounded more by the people who, I said I was going to invest my life in. I was surrounded by neo-pagans and witches, and they were becoming my friends. And those who would critique me about it were not close. They could, at best, just shout at a distance. And I was invested into that community. So I suppose I when I really got hit by it, when we got excommunicated, and the whole Wall Street Journal story that came out back in 2006, that hit me by surprise, because I was so invested into that community, spent so much time with that people. I didn't see a growing opposition coming at me, right? So it was kind of like slap, and surprised me. And I think to a certain degree, those of us who are investing ourselves in the lives of others, that some people in the church would want to keep as exiles.
Right.
We get surprised when somebody rises up and says, "How can you be friends with, gays, trans, whatever it might be, Muslim, pagan? How can you be friends with them?" We're surprised, because we're doing our best to invest ourselves in a manner we would expect Jesus would do it.
Right. And it's just important that folks understand the loss that you suffered, at least for a time, by trying to pursue what you saw as the best way forward, the most Jesus-like way forward. Mine was not to your extent, but we had moved from California to Utah, and our largest supporter was our home church that we'd been a member of for years. I had headed up their missions program. My wife was in the child care ministry. And we were out here, and we started getting increase about, they had some concerns, and I decided, all right, I'll fly out and address these concerns. And what happened was they rotate board members, and they had a guy on who he was retired from Campus Crusade for Christ, and he was raising concerns. And because my ministry wasn't about providing body counts of conversions, and I was taking an incarnational approach, investing in people, relationships, this type of thing, what I was doing was seen as inappropriate and not real mission work that was worthy of support. So they just dropped us like a hot potato.
Wow. And
that was our largest financial supporter. So there are real world consequences within evangelicalism for taking the kind of approach that you and I think is the appropriate biblical Jesus-like way forward.
Right. To what degree do you think the tendency for observable and numerical results, to what degree does that cause problems for this approach? I'm going through right now the history of the altar call, how it developed, and the history of the sinner's prayer and how that developed. And it's interesting how it tends to trend, for the most part, with the westward movement in America as it, as the nation grows and moves westward, and that interesting dynamic of a developing capitalism, right?
Yes.
And now, as there's larger gatherings, there's a need to somehow, okay, who's interested? We need to set you apart from others, and so you have this development of a sinner's bench or an anxious bench. And it develops into an altar call, and then you have to have a way of, it's almost like, let's close the deal. And we've probably both heard that terminology about coming to faith, right? As though it's some capitalistic interaction. How does that become, do you see that as a problem in us moving now to this less of a monological, but now a dialogical model of ministry?
Yeah, I think that has been kind of the approach, the template that's been followed. I mean, you mentioned capitalism. I would have said this is kind of a sales-based kind of approach, where if you're not getting sales right, if you're not getting numbers, you're not doing it right.
Right.
And so I think there's a difference between the concept of a numerical metric and other metrics of how we're impacting other people. Personally, I don't consider myself effective based upon numerics. It's faithfulness to an approach. If I am being Christ-like, if I'm pursuing this model, investing in people, then I'm successful. I'm not responsible for the numerics. And sometimes I think coming to grips with what the numerics are, that's difficult. When do people come to faith? Right? Is it the response to the sinner's prayer? Is it raising your hand? Is it a slow, gradual process where somebody can't even discern when the moment of transition was? So I don't want to get wrapped up in the numerics. I just want to exercise faithfulness to a process and let God worry about the results.
Yeah.
That's his area, working in hearts and minds. So I do think that's going to be a problem for a church that has been so numbers based, and it's very black and white. You're either in or out. Right. And we need to invest in that, again, that cruciform process of investing in people's lives. And that is far more gray and messy than I think we're comfortable with.
Right. Yeah. So I'm going to make a comment here, or I'm just going to read a comment. So Jill Riley says she was just going to say that incarnational ministry is so important. That's the Jesus way. It's our loss if we don't take the opportunity to build relationships with, quote, the other, unquote. We lose out, the kingdom loses out, and the other loses out on a chance to hear the gospel. So,
amen, Jill.
Preach it, sister. Absolutely, that's good stuff. So we're coming to the top of the hour here. Jesus didn't say shy away from messy. That's a comment from Mike Steigel.
That's right. That's right.
So on this Good Friday, how would you encourage people to pursue a multi-faith kind of approach to ministry?
Yeah, I personally love this time of year. It's always interesting to me how so many American Christians seem to invest more in the Christmas holiday than they do in Easter. And yet Christmas really didn't take significance in the church until the Easter event. And then in retrospect, Christmas becomes important. I really think we ought to use this opportunity to reflect on the life of Christ, his sacrifice. And again, what does it mean for me to practice a form of Christian spirituality where I exercise humility and empathy for others, invest in their lives, and my witness comes through the kind of life that I live, as well as the words that I speak as I invest in others and listen to others as well in that process. So I think Easter is a perfect time to have this kind of conversation. What about you, Phil?
Well, so before I say that, I want to get this in. how do people find you, and how can they connect with you? Facebook, emails, websites, what?
Yeah, they can find me at multifaithmatters.org. They can look up that name and they can find the links there. We've got a YouTube page where we have the videos of our podcast. We've got a Podbean podcast page where they can find us as well. And if they want to send me their nasty grams, they can do it at johnwmorehead@msn.com.
All right. I hope you get some nasty grams.
That's right.
So yes, there, for those of you watching this on Facebook right now, you can look for the Multi-Faith Matters page. That is it a group or a page? Do you remember?
Anyway, on Facebook, it's a group.
Okay, so Multi-Faith, one word, matters, and that's something that John and I are both part of. So you can connect with us there and hear more about this approach to doing things, as well as going to the Multi-Faith Matters website, and then you can see John's podcasting that he does. And so what would I encourage? I really think I would encourage boldness. And when I say that, what I mean is that I think it takes a lot of courage to not always defend yourself, but to listen to others and allow their lives to somehow become a part of your own. That's a courageous thing. It's kind of like the difference between staying home and traveling, right? And I think that we should be missional Christians should be adventurous, intellectual travelers. We should, and we'll find that we both learn as well as teach others. So that would be my thing.
Good words, my friend.
So this has been the Wild Theology Podcast. That is the awesome John W. Morehead. Remember, you can connect with him at Multi-Faith Matters, and you need to hear more from him because he's a smart guy.
Yeah. Always good times with you, my friend.
Good with you. Thank you so much. It's been awesome, John.
Thanks, man.